Scott Doney is a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He studied in California and then moved to the program, the PhD program of the MIT and the Woods Hole, and obtained the PhD there, and has a general interest in marine biogeochemistry and ecosystem dynamics, and particularly the global carbon cycle and how ocean acidification and other climate change related or global change related aspects will affect it. He is well known for his approach using data analysis and modeling, and he has produced a book for marine scientists on modeling. And he's an extremely extremely producing scientist with more than 250 peer-reviewed papers and more than 20,000 citations. And on top of that, he's been involved in many community programs. He has been running the OCB program. He has been involved in the Palmer Station, LTRER, and other programs which I myself don't know. So it's a great pleasure to have him here, and I hope you are as excited as I am to hear him talk about the Southern Ocean and the changes in the biogeochemistry.
Thanks. Can you guys hear me okay? I heard there were some audio-visual problems yesterday, so I did bring a paper copy of my slides, so if we do have problems, I'll start passing them around the front. As Joseph mentioned, I'm part of the Palmer Long-Term Ecological Research Station in Antarctica, and I'm going to show some results from that program and want to thank all my colleagues who have been involved for many years in that program, and also the funding agencies, the National Science Foundation, which funds Palmer, and also NASA, which has recently helped us do some remote sensing work there. So Craig did a nice job of outlining some of the aspects of export production. So I'm just showing here a cartoon. On the left-hand side is a view of how carbon dioxide is taken up by photosynthetic organisms in the surface ocean. There's respiration by heterotrophic bacteria, by zooplankton, by larger organisms. But some fraction of that organic carbon that's fixed by the autotrophs sinks or is advected into the interior, and that drives a large part of marine biogeochemistry and also plays an important role in the global carbon cycle. There are other elements as well, so just next to that is a schematic that talks about the solubility pump. Here we're interested in physical chemical dynamics where warming of the water, for example, pushes carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, cooling pulls carbon dioxide in, and then those solubility signals are then advected into the interior of the ocean. And this is the major pathway by which fossil fuel carbon dioxide that's being added to the atmosphere is advected and transported into the interior of the ocean. And the ocean is a major sink for anthropogenic carbon dioxide. And then finally, in polar systems, we're interested in the interaction of sea ice, the ocean, and the atmosphere, where sea ice can both block, for example, exchanges of gases between the ocean and the atmosphere, and then also affect physical circulation and biological productivity in the near surface waters. I'm particularly interested in the anthropogenic transient. Basically, how are anthropogenic factors such as rising atmospheric carbon dioxide and global warming affecting ocean biogeochemistry, and what are the feedbacks where, for example, we might change the amount of carbon dioxide that's being stored in the ocean? There's a growing body of evidence showing large changes in the physical climate system, so not just temperature on land or temperature in the sea surface, but we're seeing not just warming in the surface, but also substantial warming throughout the upper water column, increasing the ocean heat content. As I'll show, both in the Arctic and around the Antarctic Peninsula, we're seeing a decline in sea ice. And on land, we're seeing decline in fixed ice sources, such as glaciers, and that's adding meltwater to the Southern Ocean. And then finally, as you heat up the surface ocean, and you heat up the air temperature, you're increasing the evaporation rate, warm air can hold more water vapor, and so we're seeing large enhancements in precipitation rates, particularly in polar regions. So all of these combinations are going to be affecting ocean biogeochemistry, and I'm interested in how that's going to happen. And in particular for today's talk, we're going to be looking at the Southern Ocean. Many of you may know the Southern Ocean is very relevant to the global climate system. It's a major region where heat is being taken up from the atmosphere, so much of the anthropogenic heat, when people talk about global warming, is actually going into the ocean, and the Southern Ocean is one of the major conduits by which that excess heat is entering into the ocean interior. It's also a major region for uptake of carbon dioxide, both for the anthropogenic transient, but it's also one of the places, if you're interested, for example, at glacial, interglacial cycles, the Southern Ocean plays a key role on those millennial timescales in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the storage in the ocean. Looking up the trophic levels, particularly around the Antarctic continent, it's a very productive system that supports marine mammals, seabirds, a growing fishery, particularly for krill. And so it's a very interesting region to look at now as we're seeing substantial climate change. And as I'll emphasize later, much of this climate change is going on around the Antarctic Peninsula. We're seeing very different patterns of climate change from the Pacific sectors in the Ross Sea and the western side of the Pacific versus the eastern Pacific and South Atlantic. And I'll try to explain why some of those regional patterns are occurring. And then finally, there's a number of emerging technologies, particularly autonomous sensors, that are making it very timely to be able to look at the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is not a particularly well-sampled region, but with some of these new autonomous instruments, we may be able to get the observations we need to really understand the long-term trends associated with climate change. So one of the overarching characteristics of the Southern Ocean is the fact that you have circumpolar winds, the westerlies, that flow around the continent. Those westerlies drive the Antarctic circumpolar current, so a current throughout the water column moving to the east. The winds also drive upwelling. So there's a large wind-driven upwelling cell in the Southern Ocean associated with ecmont transport to the north that allows upwelling of mid-layer to deep circumpolar deep water. This is relatively cold water that's a mixture of deep waters that have formed in the Pacific and the Atlantic. In addition, you have cooling near the continent and formation of deep water. This upwelling circulation is bringing up old water, and because that water is old and hasn't seen the anthropogenic CO2 transient in the atmosphere, so here's the rising carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere, the water is old enough when it's being brought up to the surface, it actually acts as a major sink, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, versus, say, shallower waters in the oligotrophic subtropical gyres that are much younger and have been exposed to the atmosphere more recently. So this large sink of anthropogenic carbon dioxide has been documented both from observations of physical chemistry and also in models. This is a relatively static view of this problem, but there's a lot of variability on interannual to decadal scales within the Southern Ocean, and one of the dominant factors is what's called the southern annular mode. So we have a lot of processes that are controlled by wind-driven circulation. The southern annular mode, this is a projection of the southern annular mode onto atmospheric pressure. And what you see during a positive phase of the southern annular mode is that the low pressure over the Antarctic continent intensifies, and that accelerates the winds around the continent, provides more energy to drive upwelling around the continent. And as I'll point out, that's important later, the southern annular mode is not perfectly symmetric around the continent. It also drives northerly winds, so warm northerly winds, down onto the Antarctic Peninsula. Some of the major factors driving the southern annular mode are changes in the atmosphere composition, in particular the buildup of ozone depleting substances associated with the Antarctic ozone hole. This has been going on since particularly over the last several decades, and then it's been leveling off associated with the reduced emissions of halocarbons, chlorofluorocarbons as part of the Montreal Protocol. But over time, because of the buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, even though we're going to be fixing the ozone hole problem, the southern annular mode is still going to have long-term trends associated with carbon dioxide. So we expect as we continue into the future that this southern annular mode is going to stay strong, and in fact we'll probably see an increase in the intensity of the winds around the Antarctic, and also that they'll contract towards the pole. Now, one of the implications of this is an increase in that upwelling. I didn't mention and didn't go into much detail, but you have this large-scale overturning circulation that's wind-driven, but it's partially counterbalanced by mesoscale eddy effects. And what's been seen in a number of modeling studies over the last decade is that the mesoscale eddy effect doesn't fully compensate when you increase the strength of the wind. So as you increase the strength of the wind, you're going to see more upwelling from below. And you'd expect that to drive an increase in the amount of anthropogenic carbon dioxide that's being taken up in the ocean. And that's what's seen in models. But what you also see is that this water that you're bringing up from depth has elevated nutrients, it has elevated dissolved organic carbon. This is all of that metabolic organic carbon that's sunk to depth and been respired. When you bring up this deep water, you're also bringing up this strong biogeochemical imprint of this respiration that's occurred throughout the ocean. And so there's an interplay between, as you strengthen the circulation, you increase, now here in red, the uptake of anthropogenic CO2, but you also increase outgassing of carbon dioxide associated with this deep water source. And right now it appears that on balance, that outgassing of natural respiration carbon dioxide has a bigger effect than the increase in the uptake of anthropogenic CO2. And we actually think that the efficiency or effectiveness of the Southern Ocean at taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is slowing down with time. Now, that's actually very hard to prove from observations. The observational data that we have for the Southern Ocean are repeat hydrographic sections. This is, for example, a line in the Pacific. Here's New Zealand, here's the Antarctic continent. This line going north-south here is one of these hydrographic cruises that's being done on decadal timescales. That's not frequent enough to really resolve some of the issues of, is the Southern Ocean slowing down as a sink for carbon dioxide? How does interannual variability or even decadal variability imprint onto ocean carbon uptake? So one of the exciting new advances is the combination of hydrographic cruises with the deployment of autonomous instruments. This is an Argo float where we're seeing people add oxygen sensors, recently pH sensors, nitrate sensors that can provide continuous biogeochemical information. So along this cruise track, which was last winter, they started to deploy floats. And so what you can see is over time, in addition to these static sections every 10 years or so, you now have a continuous record that's being reported back in real time. And the SOCOM project is going to deploy several hundred of these biogeochemical floats in the Southern Ocean, and the data will be publicly available for everybody to look at. Now, transitioning a little bit from the inorganic carbon cycle side to biogeochemistry, one of the other major advances for looking at the Southern Ocean is the availability over the last several decades of high-quality ocean color measurements from satellites that allow us to make deductions about the patterns and variability of phytoplankton in the surface ocean. So this is a long-term mean pattern of surface ocean chlorophyll, and you see a band of elevated chlorophyll around the continent in about the same region where you see upwelling of deep water from below. This is a region with elevated macronutrient concentrations, nitrate and phosphate, in some regions silicate, but relatively low iron. And so this is one of the classic high nitrate, low chlorophyll regions where the role of iron that's coming both from dust and from sediments and from upwelling below is really controlling the phytoplankton population. As you move closer to the continent, that iron limitation is often released, and you see, it's a little hard to see here, but I've shown here, this is the Palmer Station record, time series record going back for about 20 years. You see these very strong blooms in green each year. These are values up in the 10, 20, 30 micrograms of chlorophyll per liter, much higher than the open ocean values, and it's an indication of release of this iron constraint. Now, the iron is either coming from local sediments, some may be being upwelled in circumpolar deep water that makes it onto the shelf, and you also have a potential glacial source. There's a lot of melting of glaciers along the Antarctic Peninsula, and that can be grinding up sediments along the way and releasing trace metals into the water column. The other thing you see here is that the blooms are highly tied to the seasonal ice coverage, where the ice can actually stratify. When the ice melts during the spring, it stratifies the water column and can accelerate phytoplankton growth in very shallow near surface levels. Now I'm going to blow in a little bit onto the peninsula. So now this is part of the Palmer LTER survey cruise going along the western side of the Antarctic Peninsula. These are some measurements from continuous underway gas sampling. Many of you have probably seen carbon dioxide data. This is the carbon dioxide data from Taro Takahashi's group. So this is a continuous sampling. We get samples every 5 minutes or so. And what you can see is that, particularly here in the southern part of the domain, the reds are waters that are close to equilibrium with the atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide. But as you get to the southern part of the grid, you see a strong seasonal drawdown in carbon dioxide associated with net community production and strong positive autotrophic carbon production. What's been added recently is measurements of oxygen, argon, and other gas tracers that provide looks at other aspects of the biogeochemical system. So for example, oxygen is also providing a measure of net community production, and because the time scale of oxygen in the surface ocean is relatively short, about a month or so, we can provide a snapshot, a geochemical snapshot of the net community production rate that's over a longer time period than, say, for example, a bottle incubation, and avoids some of the issues of bottle incubation studies. And you see that there's very good agreement between the oxygen data, places where you have elevated photosynthetic oxygen, and drawdown in carbon dioxide. Now I'm going to go in even further and now look right here, south of Adelaide Island, where there's a penguin colony. And this penguin colony, the foraging region for the penguins have been documented using satellite tags. So this pink area is the region that the penguins like to forage in. And Oscar Schofield and colleagues have been combining that information from the penguins with glider observations, where the gliders are sent into the regions where the penguins are foraging to get a better sense of what the physical, chemical, and biological conditions are. Why do the penguins set up their colony here? Why are they foraging in this region? How is that changing along the peninsula and with time? And what you see, this is just showing temperature, is the penguins are foraging in a region where you have these warm subsurface waters. These are circumpolar deep waters. They're warm for Antarctic. They're about 1 degree C or so, and they're being advected onto the continental shelf in these canyons. And it turns out that the penguin colonies are only found where you have these topographic lows that may be acting as a conduit for warm, perhaps iron-rich water that's being brought up to the surface. Maria Kavanaugh, a postdoc in my group, has used satellite observations to look to see if we can distinguish differences between the waters right over the canyons and the adjacent shelves. And for the Avian Island, Adelaide Island region, what she found is in the top panel is chlorophyll and the bottom panel is fucoxanthin, an indicator for diatoms. During high ice years, you see much larger levels of chlorophyll and diatoms over the canyon. They likely form a more consistent and stable food source for the zooplankton that are then the food source for the penguins. So I think this is a good example of how the combination of traditional hydrographic measurements and some of the new autonomous measurements can really get at some long-term problems that have remained unresolved before. Now, I had mentioned earlier that the Antarctic Peninsula is undergoing rapid climate change. It's warming as fast as any place on the planet. So this is the temperature increase over the planet, over the peninsula, particularly on the western side and into the Bellinghausen Sea. And these are the air temperature records in winter. And what you see is that we're actually approaching winter air temperatures that are close to the freezing point of water. So we may actually see a transition where rather than being ice formation regions, the air temperatures are going to be warm enough where we actually won't form locally form ice. And now, in addition to these warming air temperatures, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing an increase in winds coming from the north, and those tend to push the ice out and lead to shorter ice periods. This is an analysis from Sharon Stammerjohn along the peninsula and down into the Bellinghausen Sea. We're seeing reductions in the seasonal sea ice period of up to 3 months, where in contrast, on the Ross Sea, you're actually seeing a lengthening of the sea ice season. And this is shown here in a time series Hofmuller plot, where down in the 1980s, you had a very long seasonal ice period, and then my fingers are too big for the button. And you're seeing a reduction in the seasonal ice period, but with substantial interannual variability. So what's that doing to the phytoplankton? What's that doing to other parts of the ecosystem? Well, Montez Huguenot did a very nice study looking at coastal zone color scanner data from the 70s and early 80s, SeaWift's ocean color data and MODIS ocean color data, and was able to document a substantial reduction in the amount of chlorophyll and also the level of diatoms on the northern part of the peninsula, and an increase in chlorophyll and diatoms in the southern part of the peninsula. And our working hypothesis of what, we're seeing sea ice retreat along the whole peninsula. Why are some regions increasing in productivity and others decreasing in productivity? Our working hypothesis is that in the north, you had a system in the past which you had a fair amount of ice that was melting each season, that was adding a lot of fresh water to the surface layer, stratifying the water column. You had enough iron, nutrients, the phytoplankton took off. Now there's much lower freshwater input because there's less ice, and you're getting more winds coming from the north, leading to more winter mixing, deeper mix layers, and a much smaller bloom. Where in the south, it was more of a light-limited system. You had so much ice for so much of the year, you just couldn't have a bloom situation. As that ice starts to melt back, there you're actually seeing an increase in time. So you're seeing this sequential shift down the peninsula with very different patterns associated with the north and the south. Séverine Sallier, who's now at Plymouth Marine Lab, did a very nice inverse modeling synthesis of all the Palmer data for the planktonic system, and was able to show that particularly in the north, we've switched from a system where you had a food web that was dominated by large organisms, relatively short food chains, to more of a microbial system where a lot more of the photosynthetic primary production was being diverted into bacterial pathways and also into very small microzooplankton that were grazing on the much smaller phytoplankton that are now growing in the north. So substantial shifts throughout the planktonic food web. Grace Saba has done some nice work looking at krill. We have krill time series both from net tows, but also from samples from penguin diet samples. And one of the interesting things about krill is they have a very long lifetime. So you can see adult krill that are 4 years, 5 years old. They don't recruit every year, and you see large recruitment years of formation of eggs, and then the next year into juvenile krill, only when you've had a really highly productive year that's associated with high sea ice. So high sea ice, negative southern annular mode, you get a big krill event, lots of productivity, lots of eggs, lots of juveniles. You'll then go in low ice years, you'll have several years in a row with very weak recruitment into the krill population. And one of the concerns is we're moving from this is the old world, this is the new climate warming, climate change world. You know, how many low ice years in a row can the krill population sustain if we don't have very frequently these new high ice years? I wanted to mention a little bit, Joseph mentioned I do a lot of work on ocean acidification. There's been a lot of modeling studies indicating that the Southern Ocean in particular may be very sensitive to changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that's because as you move forward in time, the carbonate ion concentration in the Southern Ocean may decline and actually move across some of the geochemical thresholds. So this is, for example, the threshold for the saturation state of aragonite, the saturation state for carbonate, and a number of modeling studies have suggested that by mid-century, we may see corrosive water for aragonite very commonly around the continent in the Southern Ocean because the water's cold and it's also a big sink for atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is the data for the Palmer region. You see a very wide spread in the surface region in carbonate ion concentration and saturation state because of biological productivity. But if you look in the subsurface waters that are being mixed up, it's actually quite close to this threshold already, and it won't take much additional carbon dioxide to push it over the edge. We have a time series of, for example, Limacina, one of the pteropods. We haven't seen a lot of indication in the long-term time series record yet of ocean acidification effects. And so, for example, this is the Limacina time series in the southern part of our regime is actually tending to increase with time. And there, the effects of ocean acidification appear to be small relative to right now the effects of sea ice, where there's a strong impact of reduction in sea ice, low sea ice years being big pteropod years. And so this is one of those ones where there's multiple factors that are going to affect population dynamics in this region. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about glaciers. Because of the Antarctic Peninsula sticks out, the Antarctic Circumpolar rides right up along the continental slope. And this is what's called a warm slope, warm Antarctic slope, is you get a warm water coming up onto the slope, coming up onto the shelf. And there's a lot of melting going on and retreat of glaciers. All the blue dots here are glaciers that are retreating along the peninsula. Only a small number of glaciers are advancing. And because of that input of glacier water, which can be documented with oxygen isotopes, you can distinguish sea ice melt from either glacial or rainfall, snowfall melt. And this is shown here where you see, it's a little hard to see in this light, but there's more meteoric water that's either snowfall or glaciers right along the coastline. And this is also the region, this is some of Rob Sherrell's work, where we're seeing higher iron concentrations. So right along the continental, right along the shelf, right in the near coastal waters, we see a lot more iron. That's what's causing this release, these big coastal blooms. And one of the things we're interested in is over time, as more and more of these glaciers retreat, we're getting more glacial input. That's a lot of ground up sediments, a lot of probably a lot of trace metals being added. Will that have a biogeochemical impact? Rob's actually was down there just this year we're just starting to get some baseline measurements for trace metals. So hopefully in a few years we'll have a better sense of how that's changing. Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to wrap up by saying that, one of the other things we do rather than just looking at present observations is try to project into the future. The only real tool that we have for projecting into the future are Earth system models. As was mentioned in the introduction, I do modeling. I understand there's a lot of flaws in models. They're tools with a lot of limitations, but on the other hand, they're also very good for trying to pose hypotheses and develop ideas that we can then go out in the field and test, and hopefully in the process also improve the models. So this is from one particular model, the community Earth system model. It's showing all of the different factors that are changing in the Southern Ocean, warming temperature, reduced ice, changes in wind stress patterns, changes in increased carbon dioxide. This is actually showing the effects, model estimates for changes in dissolved iron around the continent. We can look at all the factors that go into these models. And one of the things that really stands out is that the Southern Ocean is a distinctly different region. If you think of all of these as multiple stressors that are going to be affecting individual phytoplankton populations or heterotrophic bacteria, all of these different environmental factors, globally, they don't look the same. So what's going on in the Southern Ocean is distinctly different in terms of these environmental stresses than other places around the global ocean. And Phil Boyd and I and several others tried to document this in a recent paper where we were thinking about as these climate clusters where, here's the global mean, everything is warming, but some regions aren't warming as much, but also you're seeing these changes in nutrients, you're seeing changes in iron, and that these different clusters might then be a good baseline for thinking about how you would design field experiments or laboratory experiments for different geographic regions to really understand what the local effects of climate change are going to be rather than some global mean. So I'll stop there. I just want to put my summary back up and also thank the Palmer team and the funding agencies of NSF and NASA. Thank you.